Hey guys, today I'm going to be going over how to enable rule-based authentication in your WebSense environment. As always, I recommend first doing a little research on the topic before you enable it. We can simply go to the WebSense support page by going to websense.com and just clicking on the support link and then typing in the search column rule-based authentication. Click search. You can see we get quite a bit of results. I want to narrow these down even a bit more to my particular product and version. So Web Security Gateway Anywhere, and I'm on version 7.8.4. Now if I click on this first link, I can see I get an abundance of information back. Everything from actually configuring the rules, so creating an authentication rule, to use cases and what the rules could potentially be used for. Sometimes it's hard to kind of figure out which method of identification you want to use. Personally, in any organization, I almost always would recommend using rule-based authentication. That way you have the flexibility later down the road, if your company expands, you can add more rules to authenticate potentially those new users into your environment very easily. To give you a little overview of where rule-based authentication would be mostly used for, are in multi-realm environments. So environments where there could be several domains that do not share a trust between each other. This allows basically you to create rule sets that say, for these particular users, I want to authenticate them using this domain. For these users, I want to authenticate them using this other domain. You're able to join essentially the content gateway to both domains, so it's able to authenticate those users no matter which domain they're in, even if those domains do not share an inherent trust. Alright, with that said, please make sure that your WebSense appliances are always up to date with the latest hotfixes and patches. The link to that can easily be found by looking in the quick links section under hotfixes and downloads, and there's also several other ways to quickly link to that page. Just make sure that you're up to the latest patch iteration on your or hotfix iteration on your WebSense appliance or your content gateway. If you have any questions about that, go ahead and contact your local WebSense team to figure out how to obtain those patches and hotfixes if you're unsure. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. Rule-based authentication is pretty easy to enable. It allows you to essentially pick between some of the most commonly used authentication methods. The one we recommend using the most is integrated Windows authentication, which is what I'm going to demonstrate how to enable using rule-based authentication. So I'm in my content gateway right now. You can see I currently don't have any authentication methods selected. You can see that it's on none right now. Rule-based authentication is located towards the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and select it and hit apply, and then restart because it's asking me to restart the gateway. Alright, the gateway's restarted. Now what you can see is that in the authentication selector, that next to rule-based authentication, a configure hyperlink popped up. You could click on that and it would take you right to the rule-based authentication page, but I'm going to manually navigate to it so you can see where it's located in the UI. So if I go into configure and I go down to security under access control, this is where I'm going to configure my authentication settings. So my first step is going to be to go into domains, and I need to add domains so I can use them in rule sets. So the first domain I want to add is my domain that I use in my environment. This is the one that the users in my environment authenticate to. So I'll click on New Domain. Domain identifier, this is simply a unique name that you want to assign to your domain so you know when you are creating rules what domains you're specifying. So I'm going to call this slab_IWA, just to identify the domain I'm connecting to and the authentication method I wanted to use when creating that domain. You can see the authentication method selected is integrated Windows Auth. That's what I want to use. But you also can select legacy NTLM as well as LDAP. I am not going to configure any aliasing. My domain name, it's just asking me to basically enter in the credentials needed to join now the content gateway to my domain. The credentials you enter in here are not stored anywhere on the content gateway. They're purely only used to join the content gateway to the domain. Once that's completed, no credentials are ever stored on the appliance itself. So, administrator name, SVC. This is the WebSense service account that I use essentially for all of the WebSense services in my environment. I usually recommend only using one service account if possible. It makes password management much easier, and you can use this service account across all of your WebSense devices and services. And then I want to specify the domain controller that I want to utilize when authenticating users or when joining to the domain. So I'll go ahead and select the one that is closest to my location. You always want to use a local domain controller if possible when joining to the domain. And then the content gateway host name. This on an appliance would be the host name associated to your P1 interface. If you have the content gateway running on a Linux appliance, it will be whichever interface you are sending proxy traffic to. So I'm going to go ahead and click Join Domain. This will take a second. Okay, you can see that the domain is now joined. It was successfully joined. This wants us to restart the content gateway. I'm going to go ahead and configure the rest of the rule sets first, and then I'm going to do a final restart at the end that will apply all these configuration settings. If at this point you have more than one domain in your environment, let's say I had a domain called Rostalab2 that some of my other users in my organization use to authenticate, then I would now enter that as a new domain and would add a second domain to this list as well. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and go into authentication rules. This is where I actually create my rules that allow me to perform rule-based authentication. I'll click on Edit File. Up top, when this page opens, you can see it's going to be a blank box at first. When you start populating rules, your rules will be specified in this box in an ordered list. You can click on any rule and move it up or down in the list using these arrows, or you can click on a rule and delete it using the X button right here. So let's create our first rule. So I want the rule to be enabled when I create it. I'm going to call it Rostalab_IWA. So I'm just calling my rule name the same as my domain name. Makes it easy to remember. You can use whatever naming schemes you like. If there are specific parameters maybe that you're specifying in this particular rule, you may want to utilize the name or create a name that is indicative of those parameters so you know what each rule is actually applying to. Each of these parameters can be filled in to narrow down the users that will authenticate using this particular rule set. So if I were to specify maybe one IP in this, essentially what that would do is it would apply this rule to authenticate using integrated Windows authentication to that one user that is specified or that one IP that's specified in this list. If I do not fill out any of these, then essentially it's like a catch-all rule. So all of my users will utilize integrated Windows authentication for identification. You have the option to do this to get very specific utilizing IP addresses, the proxy port in which the user is connecting to the proxy on, as well as user agent strings of the browsers coming through the proxy. So maybe I want to authenticate only Internet Explorer browsers using integrated Windows authentication in my environment. So I can simply click one of our predefined rules and hit include, and you can see that it places the identifying attributes of those user agent strings for Internet Explorer into the box below. This is essentially just a regex parameter. So if you want to identify maybe user agents for mobile devices or anything like that, as long as you specify something unique that are contained in those user agents, maybe for Android. For example, Android browsers utilize a user agent that has Android input into almost all of their user agents. So you could essentially add to this like you would any regex expression, and we could put Android in there as a third browser type or user agent type to look for. In my example, I'm not going to specify any of these specific parameters because all of the users in my environment utilize the same domain controller to authenticate, and there are not any special scenarios that I'd like to authenticate users with. Alright, so you have these three to get very specific, these three parameters to get very specific on how you want to identify users. Now my next step, after I've configured those, if anything, I'll specify a domain that I want them to authenticate to. So in my case, all I did was click the drop down, and it shows the domains that I populated in the list earlier when I joined my content gateway to the domain. So I want to include Roslab IWA as an authentication domain. And if you read the bulleted points to the right, they explain kind of what the input for these parameters should be and what they're used for very well. If I were to have multiple domains, potentially, I could specify those within this one rule, and I would say everybody authenticating to this proxy, I want to first try to authenticate to the IWA domain. If not, I want you to try authenticating them to the Roslab2 IWA domain. So you can essentially input as many domains in here as you'd like. One caveat to this is you want to be careful in the amount you specify and the order that you input these in. And best practices are all listed on the support page that I had showed you earlier under Rule Based Authentication. Just kind of giving some tips and tricks on how to create those particular rules and what you should watch out for when entering domains in there. Okay, let me go back. Alright, so this is quite a simple rule. I'm going to go ahead and hit add, and you can see the rule populated in that box up at the top, and it just kind of gives me an overview of what the rule contains. Looks good to me, so I'm going to hit apply. It's also letting me know I need a restart, and I'm going to hit close and quickly refresh just to make sure the rule popped up, and it did. Alright, that looks good. So now you can see I've configured the domains portion as well as the authentication rules that I'm going to use. You can have as many rules in place as you want. The order of the rules is important. Generally, the order you want your rules to be in are from most specific to least specific. So if I were to create a rule that applied to maybe 2 IP addresses in my environment, I would place that rule above this integrated Windows authentication rule, because this rule will be my catch-all. like I said earlier, if nothing is populated in the source IP, proxy port, or user agent parameters, that means this rule applies to basically anything that hits it. Okay, with that said, I'm going to go ahead and move on to the global authentication options. These options apply to essentially every authentication method that you specify in your rule sets. I'm just going to advise you on what I normally select. I always recommend testing authentication methods and methodologies out before using them. Test environments are very important in scenarios like this. The nice thing about authentication rules is if you have a specific test machine, you can specify that single machine in the source IP to test out these rules before you deploy them globally. So let me go back to global authentication options. I always select to enable for all authentication failures. Essentially what that allows is if for whatever reason integrated Windows authentication fails and the user, when presented with basic auth, potentially enters in the wrong credentials or doesn't have the correct credentials, rather than completely stopping them from being able to access the internet, we apply the default policy to that user to browse the web. Okay, the credential caching option. This is useful if you have environments that have what are called multi-tenant environments. So something like a Citrix environment within your organization. Generally, all those Citrix users will flow through one Citrix server and then out to the proxy. Traditionally, in the past, proxies would have trouble identifying these users individually because they would all look like they were coming from one source. Utilizing this credential caching, we're able to identify those users individually. This is pretty easily done by just clicking the cache using both IP addresses and cookies option, and then you can specify the IP address of the Citrix server or multi-tenant server that you're using within your environment. In my environment, I do not have any Citrix servers or multi-host environments, so I'm just going to go ahead and cache by using IP addresses only. These two settings I recommend leaving default unless you have a particular reason you would like to change these options. The redirect hostname, make sure that's populated with the hostname of your proxy appliance. This, like I said earlier, this should be the hostname of the P1 interface if you are using an appliance. If you're using a Linux content gateway, it will be the hostname that is associated to the interface that users are proxying to. Alright, now that I've set those settings how I'd like, I'll hit apply there. And it's asking me to restart. I've essentially configured everything I want to. So now I'm going to go ahead and restart the content gateway. So my proxy basic restart. Alright, the content gateway is restarted. Now I want to go verify that my settings all took and stayed in place. So let's go to domains. That's good. Authentication rules. My rules still exist, still there. And global authentication options. Okay, looks like everything's configured properly. Now I can go ahead and test. So I actually have a client machine. Alright, we'll go ahead and open a browser. And we can verify that the rule-based authentication is working properly using a method that's not very well known, but it is a very accurate way to see if your users are being identified correctly. So I'm going to go ahead and go to WebSense or test database websense.com. This is a great page to utilize if you want to test it out and see if certain users are getting the correct rule sets applied for the various categories assigned to them in policy. And quickly, if I go down to some of the security sites, which I know are blocked, and I click on one of these links, I can see that I am blocked. And if I click on more information And then I right click in this area that's right next to static category or category set by. Just right click right there and go down to view source. If I scroll down, what I can see is the actual username of the user that's currently logged into this machine and being identified. This is how I can tell if the user is being identified properly. I can also see the various roles and policies assigned to that user by doing this. Now, that's just one method to see if a user is being identified properly by the new rule-based authentication setting you've put in place. The other method is to simply utilize real-time monitor. When using real-time monitor, make sure you switch to the address of the content gateway that you want to look at. Once you've done that, you'll just click on real-time monitor, which I am right now, and on the test client, I'll go ahead and browse to, let's do CNN.com. And what I'll notice is that as I'm watching this user's traffic traverse in real time, I'll quickly see that he is being identified because I'm seeing his username. If he was not being identified properly, I would see just the IP address of the user. Now, if you are testing this in a production environment and you have traffic flowing through the box intermixed with this test user's traffic, what you can easily do is actually filter by his username, and it will only find the traffic specific to that user. Or what you also can do is pick a specific site that you know the users in your environment are not going to all the time, like a particular URL link on that WebSense test database site, and type it in here. So if I, for example, in here do CNN.com and click Show Results, you'll see I'll get all of the sites requested going to CNN.com. So that's another way that you can use to narrow down the test user you're trying to see if they're being identified properly. Okay? With that said, that's about all that's involved in the configuration of rules-based authentication. Please, once again, refer to our support page for any additional information. There's a lot of great information on there. And if you have anything further, please contact your local WebSense representatives. Thank you very much.